Welcome to the TotalBrain podcast series, hosted by Dr Evian Gordon, founder and chief medical officer of TotalBrain. Today's podcast is on how genetic brain information can empower you. Well, nature versus nurture. What a fundamental issue. Before we start, I want to introduce our key opinion leader for today, Anu Acharya. She's a serial entrepreneur, columnist, poet, and a prolific speaker at various forums around the world. As the founder and CEO of Mapmygenome, she introduced the concept of personal genomics in India with the launch of Genome Patri in 2013. She has co-founded and pioneered her first venture, Optimise Biosolutions, that included innovative bioinformatics, databases, and genome services. She has global genetics company acquisitions, multiple awards, such as the Young Global Leader Award from the World Economic Forum and the Woman Ahead Award from the Economic Times. She is a distinguished alumna from Indian Institute of Technology and also has 2 master's degrees from the University of Illinois. Well, Anu, it's great to speak to you again.
Great speaking to you too, Vivian.
I'm really looking forward to us beginning this discussion about genes in the brain.
Sounds great.
And it's an amazing topic, and before we start, I just want to kind of free associate some of the big picture issues here. That genes are not our destiny, but we do ignore them at our peril, because while we can rewire ourselves, of course, with judicious insight into our key capacities and targeted ways to train new habits, and that's the great virtue of the brain's plasticity. But we can use our genetic insights to objectively empower us to better target what we do want to rewire in ourselves. There are 20,000 genes in the human genome, in our DNA. And it's always blown my mind that every cell in our body contains the same genes. Every cell. Our distinctive genes that make up the blueprint of who we're going to be and who we are. And 1/3 of those 20,000 genes are expressed in our brain. And they express themselves at every stage of our lives. And as we all know, DNA is an amazingly complex, but again, the deep underlying essence of things, which is what TotalBrain, integrative brain is all about, is that the DNA consists of just 2 strands wound together, as we all know, in the form of a double helix, and each strand is made up of just 4 nucleotides. 4 nucleotides. It's incredible to me. They are the 4 letters that are the building blocks of all of life. And I kind of love to remember them as what they are, as at GC. A standing for adenosine, T for thymine, G for guanine, and C for cytosine, at GC. And a gene is just simply a stretch of these DNA at GCs that contain the instructions to make or regulate specific proteins. And each of us has a few variations of the order of these letters. And these variations are known as SNPs, SNPs, single nucleotide polymorphisms. And some of these SNPs in our genes these variations are visible, like for example, it's a good example, like our eye color, but others are out of sight, such as those, and most of them are out of sight, those that affect our 85 billion neurons and the electrochemistry that shapes them and modulates them, and all the timing about them, our personality preferences, like our openness or our conscientiousness, as we see in the big twin studies on genetics. So, Anu, let's look at some of these genes in our TotalBrain key capacities, maybe like 3 of those capacities. Let's select 3. And at some of the SNPs, those gene variants, in a couple of the mental health conditions that we screen for in TotalBrain. That's essentially will be the kind of the grist for them all. But before we start, Anu, would you mind giving us the big picture from your side, which is the big picture firstly, of what currently are genetics tests doing? What do they achieve and what are they aiming at?
Evian, genetics, I think, as a lot of people are familiar with, can be used for identifying ancestry that I think most people are familiar with. But it can also be helpful in identifying your traits, your disease predisposition. You can find out if you're a carrier of a certain genetic condition. You can look at your nutrition levels, your habits, and then you can find out whether certain drugs are working for you or not. And there is so much more. But I think now I'm really excited to be working with you and TotalBrain because, like you said, I think our brain is the single most important organ to study because it controls so much of who we are and in turn affects what we can become. So I think when we start to look at not just the complex anatomy and then we put the genetic code, overlay that genetic code on that, we find that these genes can lead to changes from a lot of the brain's key capacities, our mental health, our optimal brain health, nutrition, and exercise. So I think it is really exciting to be able to look at our genes, but also look at how we can actually use that information to actually make changes in our diet, lifestyle, and others, because there are studies now that we find that actually show that any changes that we do can also affect how these genes are expressing.
That's really interesting, Anu, because that brings us to a sort of one other big picture issue that's kind of relatively recent, which is epigenetics. What is epigenetics?
So I got into genomics about 20 years ago, and at that point, the human genome had just about gotten sequenced. But over the last few years, we find this new study called epigenetics. And like you mentioned, the nature and nurture debate, this starts to explain how the nature and nurture debate actually shows up in our genes, because there are these tags that are there in our DNA. The DNA, as you said, is remaining the same in all the cells, but there are these little tags on our DNA that tell it whether to turn on or off, or how much that gene needs to express, right? So if you start to measure these tags, you will start to understand a little bit more on how changes in our diet, exercise, and nutrition can actually make those changes, because it starts adding these tags onto our genes. And interestingly enough, these tags are sometimes passed on for generations, but sometimes they are temporary, which means that the individual has power to actually influence them using the diet or exercise. So the most important thing to really remember about genetic information is that we should use this genetics as a guiding star to know ourselves better and to use that knowledge to intervene and take action towards better health and peak performance.
Very spot on. Great overview. So, Anu, before we go to a couple of examples, I think I suggested we go 3 examples on total brain capacities, key brain capacities, and a couple of examples, maybe 3 or 4, on mental health conditions. Could you also just give us a sense of how this works? Like, it's so mystical to people, mysterious to people, or it certainly was to me before I saw the technology. I mean, you take this little cheek swab, and in our cases, we've also measured bloods, of course. When I sent my genome test, I just took a cheek swab, put it in the mail, sent it to you, and a couple of days later, I had my genetics report. How does that work? What's the technology that's the smarts that's pulling out these 850,000 SNPs overnight? What's going on?
So essentially, like you mentioned, right? So when somebody gets a kit in the mail, it's basically the cheek swab that you get. Now, when people take a little swab, the reason you're taking a swab is that, like you mentioned, all the cells in our body have the same DNA. So when you're taking the cheek swab, you're getting the DNA from there. And then what we do is we would actually take that, when it comes back to our lab, we would actually extract that DNA from there. And after you extract the DNA, you would either use a technology known as genotyping, which basically means that you look at all these 700 or 800,000 markers that is there on a microarray chip. So once you basically use the chip, the output that you get would be in the A, C, T, and G, like you mentioned, the @GC, right? So they can be in any sequence that you might get. The interesting thing is, and you also mentioned SNPs. So the interesting thing is when you're looking at all these different markers, you're basically looking and seeing whether does your DNA at this particular chromosome, at this particular location, have an AA or an AG or a GG, for instance. And let's assume that the G is what is making that change in that sequence. That is what we are going to be studying, right? So that is what you are looking at. So once you get the data from running this, whether you're sequencing it or whether you're doing a genotyping, the information that you get would be a lot of A, T, Gs, and Cs. And we have to study these four specific locations, which are actually found to have some correlation with either a trait or your ancestry or anything like that. You're basically going to look at those specific markers to actually then calculate a risk or sort of help you understand why you are the way you are. So in terms of understanding your traits and so on. So that's how you get that information.
Okay, I got it. So you spin down, extract the DNA, you put it into these machines that have extraordinary technology to get the letter sequence. Then you've got a database. You compare that sequence to the database. And when I got my report back, what I saw is, okay, these are all the factors whereby your letter sequence was in the right order. And these were the SNP variants where your letter sequence is in an order that's been switched around and that may predispose you to having a risk factor for certain things. So, for example, can we just unpack that a little? So, for example, Anu, I'm a migraine sufferer. So the numbers that you got back to me was a population number where you said, okay, 14 out of 100 people on the planet, on average, are going to have a predisposition to get migraine. So you said, okay, the basic risk is 14 out of 100, but your personal risk is double that. Is that the essence of these reports? Is that all it is?
So one has to be very careful when you look at the report, right? So for instance, in the case of migraine, 14 out of 100 is you're very likely to find somebody who has migraine because it's every 14 out of 100. Now, in many other conditions, they are fairly rare. So if you have to look at the denominator to basically look at, say, if it says that the average number of cases found in this particular condition is 1 out of 10,000 or 100,000, then you know that the condition is rare. But at the same time, you might still be at twice the risk, which still means that you still have a little bit higher risk than the average person, but it doesn't mean that you will get it. So I think that's the difference that one needs to understand, that it's a relative risk. So ultimately, I think we use genetic counselors to explain what that relative risk means for that specific condition so that they understand that this risk is what they can do about the risk, and also explain to them whether the condition is very rare or whether it's a fairly common condition in the population that they are in.
So that's kind of super important because there's been a lot of controversy since consumer genetics test arose, and some of the early movers ran into big challenges with the FDA because they said you can't just give people genetics risk about clinical information without context. And so if I hear what you're saying, the context that you have is that when somebody has clinical information that's been lodged with the FDA to be able to report on it, that you want to then give them the context that their general number might be very rare. So when they get 3 times increasing that, it's not necessarily, hugely risky. Although it's very alarming when you see that you have a 3 times increase to get it. You non-consciously, I know when I see it, non-consciously I go, oh my goodness, that's a little threatening. That's challenging. It's what do I do? But it's all about context. So my understanding on is there's sort of 3 levels to the genetics reports that you've mentioned. The first is that some of them are just like fun, curiosity, like Ancestry, which is cool. Anybody gets that there. Tens of millions of people who've done genetics consumer tests. So that's the one level I see. The second is what Mapmygenome and TotalBrain are trying to do with, not trying to do, are doing with a genetics test that is linked to our brain capacities and screening, just screening the mental health conditions that we'll talk about in a moment. And that's really more just an empowering information that's not actionable. It's just giving people context about their strengths, their limitations, and what they may be at risk for. But when you actually give people that information clinically and say, okay, so for example, the first personalized medicine, precision medicine, which is driving so much of personal health around the world, began with the FDA and in the United States, but really is a major driver of the future of healthcare. It's been super successful in cancer, where I believe the first example was with the breast cancer drug Herceptin, whereby if you had one of the right GC SNP variations, you would respond to that drug, and if you didn't, you wouldn't. And so for $40,000 per year drug, they needed to know, and that's become the way that cancer operates. And now immunotherapy, personalized immunotherapy. And I suppose we're trying to do the same thing in the brain, obviously, just highlight that information in the brain. But your genetics counselors, I presume, really come into play when you provide that clinical information. Is that how it works in India anyway?
Correct. So actually, we typically provide genetic counseling with most of our tests. And I think the reason for that is that the knowledge of genetics is still very, very low. And one of the things we need to always explain to customers is that it's not just genetics. There are many other factors that are there. For instance, your lifestyle, what you're eating, how you're exercising, and so on. So one of the things that the genetic counselor does is to re-emphasize that, genetics is not your destiny, but it can be used for making much more wiser choices. That's the role that the genetic counselor is playing, that they're not just explaining technically what relative risk means and what this particular risk means for you and what recommendations are there, but they're also gathering information and trying to make consumers more aware of how they're actually living their lives so that they can actually make specific changes which will actually ultimately help to lead a much better life. So I think that's the reason why we do that. And when you look at it from a clinical condition, I think it becomes even more important because you need to explain to them how does genetics actually work. You draw a very detailed family history, take a very detailed family history. You start to put in the interplay between their lifestyle, between their genetics, and then give them specific information and recommendations on what can be done. So they play a very, very important role.
Yep, no, that's so important and helpful context. Thank you, Anu. So let's move to some of the examples now. And I think I suggested at the beginning, if maybe you could give us the genetics SNP at GC examples of what are strengths and limitations in, say, maybe 3 TotalBrain key capacities. And then let's move on to maybe look at 4 mental health conditions that are screened in the TotalBrain report and what the at GC SNP variants, just one example of each, Anu.
I think as you had explained earlier, all of the brain capacities and mental health conditions are underpinned by many genes. And in many cases, it's not a single gene that is responsible. But what I'm going to take as examples are specific genes so that you get to understand how they actually function. But if you look at a report, there might be multiple genes that are influencing a particular brain capacity or a mental health condition. So if we start with everybody's favorite, which is stress and the anxiety that comes with it. So when we are stressed, basically a whole bunch of neurotransmitters called catecholamines are released. And that includes the dopamine, the epinephrine and the norepinephrine, which is, I think, the adrenaline that we all talk about. Now, there is a gene in our body called COMT, which is making an enzyme called catechol O-methyltransferase, which is what it stands for. But anything that ends with an ase is an enzyme. But when you are stressed, then it can't make that in reasonable quantities, especially if there's a genetic variation that points to an increased likelihood of stress, which means that when you are stressed and you have the genetic variant, then your body is not able to make enough of this. So, which means that once you know that, you realize that it's not just the variation, but it's also the stressors that are coming in that add to that. So once you know about it, you can actually make wiser decisions in terms of diet, your exercise, as well as an environment to de-stress. So people can actually make those changes.
Yeah. So, and is that gene related to any of the other capacities?
Absolutely. So this is also has shown correlation to several other brain capacities, such as focus, planning, and resilience. So you can see that if you have a genetic variant and you're adding stress to your environment, then you're not just getting stressed, you're actually impacting how you focus, how you plan, and how resilient you are. So it's a lot of stress that we talk about. One has to be very careful, especially when you have those genetic variants.
So it's a great example, and a good example also of the interconnectedness, Anu, of both the capacities in the brain. The brain is so highly interconnected, those 85 billion neurons, but particularly the seminal importance of stress. It's a really good example of why information can be power. I know for myself, when I saw my stress, genetic predisposition to stress, it really did make a difference or just it just helped nudge me towards that sort of continual awareness that I do need to be super vigilant and train and diet and exercise with great clarity. And many, many people who've had their genetic reports have told me what was empowering. That was the top. Do you mind giving two other examples maybe of capacities?
Another example is that of emotion awareness, right? So in this particular case, we find one of the genes that's responsible, for instance, the CACNA1C gene. And this gene actually is providing instructions for making several calcium channels. Now, this is found actually in the cardiovascular system, but also in the brain. And what was interesting was that in several studies in both healthy and diseased individuals, they said that when they found a genetic variation, they saw a slower response time to the facial emotion recognition abilities, which basically meant that there was a genetic variant that could likely to be able to show a slower response time. Now, one thing I would like to add over here is that sometimes when you have that, I think the best way to overcome that is to practice. So there is the whole concept of if you are aware that that is where you lack, you're probably likely to be able to benefit if you can go to TotalBrain and be able to do some of the exercises that are recommended. And I think that's the way that it's not just about genetics, but if you combine the two, it becomes very, very powerful. So another example is that of social phobia. And this is again, there is a SNP there, which is an intronic variant, and it's found in the serotonin receptor gene, transporter gene. And we find, interestingly, and the reason I'm taking this example is that this is also shown to be a marker for depression, right? So it's interesting that some of these traits that we see can also be markers for other mental health conditions. And similarly, I think there are many other genes that are responsible, whether it's the dopamine receptor gene, the DRD2 gene that shows up in many, many different areas like flexibility, inhibition, working memory, feedback-based learning, and so on. So in most of these cases, we realize that multiple genes are involved in different aspects of brain performance. So you might find the same marker that is responsible for multiple brain conditions, and similarly, multiple genes that are responsible. And all of these are done by looking at large population studies where you can specifically identify that trait and be able to make sure that those studies are done in multiple different studies for us to be able to pick those markers out. Yeah, so all I was going to say is that because now that people have this information, they are able to then make those changes, whether it's in diet or behavior or exercise, so that they can actually get the maximum benefit out of it.
So those are good examples. Thank you. Could we end off, Anu, with a few examples of the mental health conditions that we screen in TotalBrain? Maybe anxiety and depression, ADHD, and possibly addiction if we have time.
Since you mentioned anxiety, I think one of the SNPs that is there is a variant in the BDNF, which is the brain-derived neurotrophic factor gene. Now, a lot of people who do a lot of exercises have probably heard about this gene, but this gene is actually known as this master brain molecule because it actually regulates the survival and growth of neurons, but it's also involved in a lot of different activities, whether it's in the hippocampus for memory or amygdala circuitry, which is for the emotions and so on. So you're basically looking at a gene which is sort of this super molecule. What it's doing is when you have a genetic variation, it's changing one amino acid from valine to methionine, and it causes these changes, which means that now if you have this variation, you're producing less of this BDNF, and as a result, you are likely to be more anxious, right? Now, the best news that anybody can get, I think at least in 2020, is that we have seen that aerobic exercise can actually affect the gene expression, which means that even if you have the genetic variation and you're aware that you have the genetic variation and you do 20 to 30 minutes of aerobic exercise, you're able to counter that effect of the genetic variation. So I think that's the best part about getting that information and making sure you act on that information that you have. So that's the first example on anxiety. The second example, maybe if I can take ADHD. And here, one of the genetic variants is also an intronic variant, and this is in the norepinephrine transporter gene called NET1. And what it does is that it modifies those expression levels. And since this particular NET1 gene is actually regulating our brain signaling and function, especially the attentional process. So whenever there is a gene variation, it's basically resulting in a chemical imbalance of these neurotransmitter molecules, right? And that's also one of, when you start studying the mechanisms of ADHD development, that is there. So if you look at that particular gene variant, you find that it contributes towards ADHD. But it's not the only gene that is contributing to it. There are also other genes like your dopamine genes that are responsible in the DRD4 and a few other genes that are there. But again, once you know about the knowledge about this, you can actually make some changes. You're a little bit more aware. You're able to actually make certain changes based on this. I think you mentioned addiction, right? So I think addiction is an interesting thing because I think there are lots of social and cultural influences on alcohol consumption. So I know, for instance, that when we did a report on some people, especially my mom, she had one of the markers. But the good thing is she doesn't even consume alcohol, which basically means that you might have the gene, but it's never going to express. But when you look at the SNPs in the mu opioid receptor gene, we find that it's a change in your one letter. So it is changing the amino acid. And it's basically because this particular, receptor protein is involved in pain and reward mechanisms and also positive reinforcements. It basically affects how much dopamine is released in the part of the brain which is involved in the rewards part of it. So basically it says that we find that anybody who has those variants are predisposed to a much higher release of dopamine and a higher euphoria because of alcohol consumption, and therefore they are likely to develop addiction. So once you are aware of that, I think one of the things they can do is to make sure that how and where they drink alcohol, they can manage to keep track of that. But second is also to make sure that they don't be in conditions that will force them to do something like that. And if they do more exercise, they're likely to probably not get more addicted and so on. But I think it's important for people to understand that they do have those markers, and therefore they need to make sure that if they get to the other side, it'll be a difficult side to come back from.
Let's end off on depression, because I think that's just so common that I think we just useful to have a snippet into there.
Yeah, so I think depression has hundreds of genes that are implicated, and many of them are, they're related to the serotonin, the mood regulator gene. One of them is in the PCLO gene, and so on. And basically, we find that again, this variant influences how much of that is released in the brain, and as a result, because of that, it affects a lot of the HPA activities, your gray matter volume, and so on. And what was interesting for me was that this particular variant was not just linked to depression, but it was also linked to depression-associated traits like your reduced novelty seeking or greater fearfulness and so on. But I think that you know a lot more about depression, given that you've been doing a very large study on this, on how people respond to certain drugs. It would be great to know a little bit more about that.
Oh, thank you. I'll mention that briefly, Anu, thank you. TotalBrain has done is a study that to try and be the first test in psychiatry to predict treatment response using genetics and using other measures, but mainly genetics. And that was a big study. It was a $16 million study with 1,700 people with depression. And there is a test that we've generated from the first 1,000 people. It's been designed in conjunction with the FDA, and we're talking to them now about doing the replication. So the point is that just like with cancer, which has changed the nature of treatment by personalizing it, precision medicine, many, many groups are trying to find the first test in psychiatry. It's shocking to me that in psychiatry, there's still not one test that predicts treatment response. But obviously, we hope that we can do it, and that it's looking interesting, and we'll see where that replicates. But even if it doesn't, Anu, the interesting point about what you're saying is that, firstly, it's early days. I don't want to overstate the case, but some objectivity helps at any level. So there's already companies that are doing genetics tests to help predict the side effects and the dosage to get that more accurate in depression. That, of course, they lack the treatment prediction, which hopefully we can add. But in addition, the other SNPs, like, for example, Professor Alan Schatzberg used our data from this big study to look at a gene called ACBC, and that's a gene that regulates the way most drugs come in through the blood-brain barrier into your brain or out of your brain. And some people have just a genetic predisposition to, and they're sort of sensitive. That's why some people are sensitive to the dose of drugs and to the drug itself, and other people less so. So my point that I want to make about BDNF, this, you called it the master gene, and genes like ACBC, these are the big ones that seem to have huge implications. And so what all of us are going to do as we move through these reports over time and get the data analyzed, and they go into AI engines and bigger databases, we'll be able to stratify which are the most important genes. And so hopefully people who do choose to get their consumer tests will keep your context in mind, and it's a great context. I do just want to end off on one quick mention, which is many people ask me about Alzheimer's tests, and we know that everyone knows there's many genes that are predicting it, ApoE being the most common. But some people have said to me, look, I don't want to know. I mean, because at this point anyway, there's nothing you can do yet about curing Alzheimer's. Certainly it's helpful in my view anyway, biased as it is, that the knowledge is, again, empowering in the sense that you can make the most of your brain rewiring, whatever the circumstances. But anyway, the point is, I know that when we're doing the Mapmygenome TotalBrain report, if people don't want to get their Alzheimer's because they just find it just too confronting, they just tick a box and they don't get that piece. So that's part of what I think is part of the empowerment, is personalized confidentiality, personalized choice, and context that you're providing as a great example. It's just helping empower people. So thank you so much, Anu, for giving us, firstly, a context about how genetics are used. Secondly, how it works. Thirdly, specific examples and context about them, some of the TotalBrain key capacities and mental health conditions. And I suppose I just want to end off by saying, Anu, that, there are only two things that all humans have in common, and that's our brains and our genes. And it's kind of ironic to me, deeply ironic, that 99.9% of our genes are the same in all 98 billion humans on the planet. Our differences are tiny percentages of these, at GCs that create some of the distinctive variations that we have. And yet, there is this extraordinary them-us divide. For example, for people who have mental health challenges, we have this weird bias about the pejorative labels that people get. And of course, the implicit bias, the genetic implicit bias, the abomination of institutional racism. Extraordinary in the face of the reality of our inherent genetic similarities. There's no them and us. There's only us. And I suppose that, dear people, that nature, nurture, and societal conditioning discussion is clearly one for another day. So thank you so much, Anu, for speaking with me today.
Thank you, Evian. And absolutely, DNA proves that we are all the same with all our distinctions, our individualities. But I'm really excited that we are bringing the brain to the genetics world. And I'm very, very looking forward to that.
Me too. Thank you, Anu.